Well, hello all. We are right at the 12:30 Eastern mark, 9:30 a.m. Pacific. So I want to go ahead and get started because we've got quite a bit to chat about. I would love in the chat if you can just let me know that you can hear me and that I'm coming through okay, and you can see me okay, and that you can see the slides that I've got up okay. And then also, if you don't mind, just drop in where you are joining from, kind of where in the world you are connecting from. So I know we'll have a lot more people joining, and hopefully they'll be able to see the chat. Mackenzie, all right, first one in the chat, seeing and hearing and coming through strong. Perfect. So as long as you can see and hear me, that's all that matters. Everybody else we'll figure out later. So I'm super excited to have the opportunity to chat with you about some things that I've learned over the course of my career, and honestly, things that I'm continuing to learn over the course of my career. I will promise you a couple different things. I'll use the slides to drive our conversation and use our conversation to drive some of the slides. I'll keep them in this form just so I can bounce around a little bit, and absolutely want to hear from you in the chat. So I'll try and keep an eye on that also. So if you have questions, drop them in there and I'll make sure that we get to them, and maybe even weave a couple of them into the conversation that we're having. But similarly, I'll leave some time at the end to make sure that I can answer anything that's coming up. One of the other things I will guarantee is that, like it or not, at the end of this, we are not going to solve for all of the challenges associated with culture or run a startup or being in business or running and scaling a diverse organization. I think what I would love to do is kind of lay the foundation for what's going on right now, what do we know, and what are a handful of things that you can take away that are really practical, really deliberate, really intentional that you can start to implement right away, as opposed to bombarding you with a lot of different stuff. So I'll talk through kind of just the agenda really quickly. Would love to just lay the foundation again on what do we mean when we talk about kind of diversity. I was just on the panel a little bit ago watching, and part of what Tracy and Laura were talking about is, we've done the work of laying kind of the groundwork for why is diversity and inclusion important. So I'm not going to bombard you with a bunch of the data and the statistics and the research. There's more than enough of that available, and I'm happy to give it to you offline. But really what I want to get to here is a little bit of what are we talking about? Why does it matter? So some specific instances where it matters. When does it matter? So start to get into, so as I'm scaling a startup, whether I'm a founder, whether I'm a VC, whether I am, doing anything along those lines, or even in an already established organization, what are some of the things that I can do as we start up new teams, as we bring together mergers and acquisitions, as we scale from 50,000 people to 100,000 people? A lot of these concepts will still hold and still be true. And then ultimately, and I would argue most importantly, so what do I do about all of this? So I'll give you kind of two quick models that I think may be helpful. One, just a set of questions, and then another one, kind of an overarching framework that you can use to think about. So how do I pull all this together? So I put in a slide because if I don't remember to put this slide in, then I will immediately go in and not spend any time talking about myself, which is actually the way that I prefer it. But my name is Khalil Smith. I spent over 14 years at Apple from 2002 to 2016. So I was there from just after the launch of the iPod all the way up to and through the launch of the Apple Watch, and worked kind of through our retail stores and in our corporate facet, really to build up culture, to deliver incredible experiences, and to help onboard and train some of the 60,000 employees that we had in the retail side when I was there, across over 400 stores all over the world. So a lot of my work and the work that the team that reported into me was responsible for was about culture, was about diversity and inclusion, and how all of that fits together, and how do you both establish a really strong culture, but also make it easy for new people to join and to be a part of that experience. And so those things can at times feel mutually exclusive because some of the strongest cultures feel like you're either in or you're not. And some of the most inclusive places are very easy to become a part of the culture. So really balancing those things becomes incredibly important. From there, I moved on to a cognitive science consultancy, which is basically just a fancy way of saying we use things like behavioral economics and social psychology and neuroscience to better understand why humans do what we do, and then use that to make really intelligent decisions about how to partner with businesses. So those are all the way from startups to Fortune 50 companies. I am a proud Tar Heel. If it tells you anything about how inclusive I am, I have my oldest son going to Duke. So if you know anything about college sports in the US, you know that Duke and UNC are about as big rivals as you can get. So I always like to point that out to kind of increase my chops around what inclusion looks like. And then currently I'm our Vice President of Inclusion, Diversity, and Engagement at an 8,000 person technology company by the name of Akamai. So in the prior chat that we were having, on the one that I just came off of, there was someone, Tiffany, in the chat who said, wait a second, are we talking about diversity or are we talking about inclusion? Because those are not the same thing. And I think that's such an incredible point and such a smart point and worth really calling out. And so I've started lots and lots of presentations over the years with a slide similar to this idea that diversity is not the same as inclusion, is not the same as unconscious bias. Oh, and actually it was Natasha, I'm looking in the chat. It was Natasha that called that out, that diversity is not the same as inclusion. So I want to make sure I get that attribution right. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Natasha. But I think what is valuable about that is there's so many terms going on around right now. And sometimes we conflate all of those into this idea that we're just talking about D&I or DE&I or ID&E, and it just becomes one big kind of mass of a conversation, where in reality, there's a lot of value in pulling that apart, disaggregating it, and being clear about what it is that we're solving for, because there are things that we can do that will have longer term benefits and broader benefits as a whole. And yet, if we're not clear about what we're solving for, then the tools that we're deploying are not going to actually move the needle. And so we should ideally be kind of moving all of these things in the right direction. And I would argue that that is a critical part of culture, is are we creating a diverse environment? Are we also creating an inclusive environment? Are we also paying attention to fairness and equity and representation? There are all of these different things. And even as we see new job postings pop up, because we know a lot more organizations are leaning into this space, some because they feel like they're being dragged in, and others because they recognize that they haven't been doing this work before, are adding a lot of these terms and this is kind of verbiage to their job descriptions. So whether it's around justice or belonging or fairness or equity, these are all critically important, but they are slightly different and distinct, and yet come together and have a high degree of overlap. And so something that I have found useful when talking to executives or others is just this idea, and there are lots of folks that have phrased it differently, but for me, diversity is a seat at the table, inclusion is a voice at the table, and bias is part of why some voices are listened to or heard more than others. And so we can weave other things in there. And so in my work, we talk quite a bit about engagement. And so I tell people that engagement is caring about what's talked about at the table or what's decided at the table, right? Because I've absolutely worked in places where I was included, and yet because I wasn't really engaged anymore, and I had kind of already moved on from that organization intellectually or emotionally, if not yet physically, I just decided, all right, I'm just going to kind of go through the motions here. And that's not my proudest time, but it absolutely happens. And anyone that's heard me speak will hear me say, my mother, when I first started managing people, said, if you don't treat people well, they will either quit and leave or they will quit and stay. And so that lack of engagement, all of these things come together into, are we really empowering people, engaging them, bringing them to conversation? So when we think about diversity, it is important to recognize that there are different types of diversity, right? There is identity diversity and cognitive diversity. Those tend to be the two kind of larger buckets that academics and researchers will talk about. And identity diversity are a lot of the things that we have tended to think about over the time that this work has happened, whether that's around race, ethnicity, gender, age, ability, location, geography, things like that. And cognitive diversity is one that we likely have heard a bit more about, things like preferences for introversion versus extroversion, things like processing styles or Myers-Briggs or DISC profiles, or where you grew up or your background or your culture. And so while those are absolutely both relevant, there's a pretty decent body of research that shows that identity diversity carries along with it some cognitive diversity. That by bringing people into your organization or physically sitting at a table or being on a Zoom or a Run the World with people that look different than you actually activates different parts of your brain. It reduces things like what's referred to as social loafing, which is just this idea that if I feel like everybody else has the same information that I do, I tend to not push as hard. I tend to not challenge as often. I tend to not contribute as much unique information. And so while absolutely cognitive diversity is important, I would encourage us to challenge that perception that this is diversity, right? You can have a bunch of people that are largely the same. And you'll notice I'm not saying like all male, all female, all one particular gender, whatever the case is. When the vast majority of people come from a similar background or a similar kind of demographic, we can lose some of the benefits of bringing in people that will likely have different perspectives and different experiences than we do. And so why does it matter? Again, I won't spend a lot of time here, but it matters in large part because we have on the whole, and you all, whether you're investing, whether you're building something brand new, have moved on from the place of linear, non-creative, relatively routine tasks, right? Again, large bodies of research show if all you need is people to kind of focus in, do something, work on the assembly line, I don't care about your opinions, I don't care about your point of view, well then sure, hire the best possible shoemakers you can find, hire the best possible pizza box folders that you can find. That is absolutely valuable. And yet, when we start thinking about these non-linear tasks, right, where tomorrow is not the same as today, is not the same as yesterday, or where we're asking people to kind of try to forecast the future or think creatively or use less resources than we've used before, that it's overwhelming that diverse and inclusive teams perform better in those types of tasks over and over and over again. And I don't know very many startups or very many kind of 21st century companies that are saying, no, what we're doing is actually really routine, really simple. We don't want any perspective from people. We don't want their best. We just we don't need their heads or their hearts. We just need their hands, right? That's not the case anymore. And because that's not the case, we do absolutely benefit from diverse and inclusive teams and all of the kind of benefits associated with that. And so when does it matter? This is one of the things that comes up when I'm either partnering with a startup and they're saying, okay, but when do we need to start to diversify our team? Because I've only got 3 or 4 employees. I don't know that we're at the point yet where I can start saying, well, I'm absolutely looking for this, or I'm bringing in this type of background. Maybe a number of the people that I'm working with are my closest friends. And we tend to be around people that are largely similar to us. There may be some differences, obviously, but on the whole, when we're first kind of kicking something off, it may be people that are much more similar to us. But the same question comes up when we're working or dealing with really large organizations is, what should I be focused on? When does this matter? When do we really need to put the energy and the effort in? And so there's a quote that I absolutely love that I'll kind of, put out here. This idea that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And what I mean by that and where this comes in for me is that ideally this work is work that you have been permeating throughout your organization for as long as you can remember, right? It is critically important that we remember that when we're talking about DEI, and I'll just call it that for kind of ease because that's what most of us are familiar with, that is not separate from your business. It's not separate from your talent plan. It's not separate from your culture. These things are woven together. And the more that we try and separate them out and think that, well, I've got my strategy and then I've got these other pieces, or I've got my business plan and then, well, yeah, we'll figure out the people part later. It is almost impossible to build the type of organization that investors want to invest in nowadays, that customers want to do business with nowadays, that employees want to continue to work with nowadays. And so it's challenging to be one of the first of something if you're walking into a team of 5 people is extremely challenging to be one of the first of something when you're walking into a team of 50 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. When you say, well, wait a second, why wasn't this a priority before? Why weren't we paying attention to it before? And so it's not necessarily that you can, take this into account at the very, very beginning, but if you're not thinking about it, and if you're not being deliberate, and if you're not using a couple key questions, then I think that you are inherently failing in the opportunity to really build things from the ground up. And so 2 questions that I kind of put out to leaders and that I would put out to anyone building an organization or thinking about, okay, well, we didn't start doing it 20 years ago, but can we start doing it today? And how do we start doing it today? Number 1, are we getting ready to make significant hires? Right? People on the whole, and we see this whether it's through Pew Research or through McKinsey or through Deloitte, want to work in a place where they believe that they can be successful. And increasingly, we view some of that through the lens of, are there people higher in the organization who look like me or who have followed a path similar to the path that I followed? And so it's not just enough to kind of bring in diversity or underrepresented groups at the lower levels of your organization. We're now at a point where we're getting nuanced enough in the conversation to say, but what does it look like on the board? What does it look like in kind of key advisory positions? What does it look like in key strategic positions? And have we just kind of added people in and then said, hey, look, we're fine? Or are we really bringing people to the table who can help make critical decisions about the organization? And that goes to the second question is, are we getting ready to make big strategic decisions? One of the main benefits, through the research and all of that around diverse teams that marry that inclusion is that we make better decisions. And so if we're making the same decisions using the same groups over and over again, we find things like group polarization, groupthink, kind of these intellectual laziness, for lack of a better way of putting it, where our brains are built to conserve energy. And so if we can get to an answer really quickly and it feels right and everyone else around the room is saying, yeah, absolutely, that totally sounds right. Wonderful. We got to that decision really quickly. Let's lock it in and then go do a bunch of other things. That can feel a lot easier than having people around the room that are saying, well, wait a second, I'm not quite sure about that. And let's challenge that idea. And, I see it differently. I think we need to come back at that. I've got different data. And so sometimes we fooled ourselves into thinking that the most successful teams are the ones that feel the most fluid, when in reality, the most successful teams are the ones that can manage their conflict, can really kind of debate things, challenge things, see them from different angles, and then end that debate, make a decision, and then execute uniformly. And so we mistake sometimes that uniform execution for uniform agreement at the very beginning. And it's important to separate those two things out. And so if you're not asking yourself these questions around, are we getting ready to make significant hires? And if we are we bringing in the right people? And are we getting ready to make big strategic decisions? And if we are we bringing in people that see the world differently and have grown up in different circumstances potentially? Then you're missing opportunity. Now, that said, you're not always going to have these, right? These are not always going to be the things that are the day-to-day of your business. And I would be remiss if I left you thinking that the only time that diversity is important is when you're making these big decisions. I think that this is critically important because if you're not paying attention there, then you're just missing the boat completely. But even if you're paying attention there, culture is not what happens, once every now and then, right? You can have the best Valentine's Day ever, but if you're a pretty crappy partner for 364 days out of the rest of the year, then you're ultimately a pretty crappy partner. Right. And so to bring people in when you're going to make big decisions, but to not have that be a part of your culture and a part of the way that you just operate your business is absolutely an area of opportunity. And so what are some things that you can do about it on a day-to-day that can scale across the size of an organization and can scale across kind of getting work done on a regular basis? This idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? I used to hear this all the time throughout business, and it was kind of a regular regular, mantra of folks that like, you've got to pay attention to your culture. And I would even argue that your culture is driving your strategy. The best idea you can possibly have, if you don't have the right people to implement it, if it's really challenging to go out and find people to join your organization, it makes it incredibly difficult to scale. And we've seen that across, newer companies that have stood up and then recognized when they got to a certain point, whether it was pre-IPO or right after IPO, have started to experience a lot of those culture challenges and have been kind of caught looking and saying, what could we have done differently to not be in this space right now? And so there are a lot of things that we can do, and it's all of those things that we're describing. But on top of that, I will give you kind of three spaces in this particular kind of category. One is around awareness, one is around behaviors, and one is around codes. So what do I mean by awareness? So when we're thinking about bias and bias mitigation or diversity or inclusion or unity or equity, any of those things, part of the kind of first part of the conversation is, are we even aware of what we're talking about? And so you see here, I've put kind of knowledge is power, because over and over what the data shows and what our experience shows is that just being aware of something is not enough to fundamentally change our behaviors or to change our environment. Right? Most of us know that we should work out more than we do, that we should eat better than we do, that we should save more for retirement than we do. And most of us know that our organizations would be better if we didn't surround ourselves with people that looked like us or thought like us or that we felt really comfortable with. And yet we do it over and over again. And so as so many of you are thinking about how do I kind of disrupt a market that people have gotten lazy in or disrupt a category where there's an amazing opportunity to do something new, learn from what we've done in the past that hasn't worked, not just in terms of products or categories or kind of our systems, but in terms of the way that we've operated as well. And so there's a lot of value in raising awareness around some of these things. So whether it's, exploring unconscious bias training and helping people to understand, but over and over again, it is clear to us that just kind of bringing people in and saying, hey, by the way, we all kind of carry biases and we operate in biased ways. Could you just stop doing that now? As much as we would love to, that's not the way it works. It's just not realistic. It's not the way we're built. And so we need to move beyond that. So the reading and the education and the TED Talks, they are all extraordinarily valuable. But if all we do is stop there, then we get some of the same results that we've seen around things like people know we shouldn't smoke, yet we still sell lots and lots of cigarettes. Or again, many of us want the environment to be better and yet drive cars maybe that aren't as fuel efficient as we'd like, or eat more meat than maybe we should. And so the awareness is not enough, but it is a critical first step. The next thing we want to get to are the behaviors. So how do we start to walk the walk in an organization? And that looks like things like being really clear around what is it that we're hiring for? Because if I go into an interview and I'm not confident that I know exactly what I'm meant to be interviewing for, then I interview for how closely I either like this person, and in some ways that's a proxy for how similar are they to me. And so if I don't know what I'm interviewing for and I'm just kind of walking in to see, is there a culture fit? And you see that all the way at the bottom bullet, more and more organizations have gotten away from this idea of culture fit towards culture add, because culture fit means you already fit in. You already connect with what we've got. Culture add means you are bringing something unique and novel to the conversation, something that we would not otherwise have had. And so these all get to this idea of how do we start to behave in different ways after we've got the awareness? How do we clarify places where the awareness told us, well, we're not quite there yet. I see this thing happening when we're interviewing people or in our meetings or in the way that we're conducting ourselves, and I don't quite like it. And so these are ways that we can change and ways that we can continue to adapt. This third bullet that you see, amplifying in meetings, is one that gained a lot of prominence actually in the Obama administration, that even as inclusive as that administration wanted to be, lots of the senior women found that they were either being talked over in meetings or that their ideas were being co-opted by other people. And so they devised a strategy where when one woman would say something, another one would amplify that message. Now, allies can do that as well, but it's a great way. And again, research shows over and over again that, ideas get taken, somebody else says it, and all of a sudden it's Khalil's idea, when in reality, somebody else was the one that had actually described it or articulated it first. So each of these are ways to really walk that walk in terms of behaviors and to make sure that we're being really clear around what we expect. And then codes. And so you could call this a number of different things, but I called it codes in part because I grew up at Apple and we would talk a lot about coding and talk a lot about kind of the hardware, the software of things, the underlying operating system. And so when we think about the codes, they are the things that mitigate bias or the things that really drive our desired behaviors at the very root of what we're trying to accomplish. So you see things like this, and even in the conversation just before this, we were talking about machine learning or artificial intelligence. And part of what I saw in the chat is also part of what has concerned me about some of this, which is there is no silver bullet. I've heard folks say there is no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. And what they meant by that was there's no one thing that we're ever going to deploy that is going to all of a sudden turn this around and we're going to say, oh my gosh, it's so perfect, everything is wonderful. And yet there are a collection of things that we can do that are really beneficial. So if we know that people with unique names or non-traditional names or people with ethnic sounding names, if you will, tend to, through the research, show that they get callbacks less often, well, then one of the ways to remove that bias is to remove names. Or if we know that, if you went to, UNC Chapel Hill because I did, and you immediately start to bring that up, that we're going to have a very different conversation to somebody that went to a different school. Well, then how do we just remove that from the conversation altogether so that we really can focus on the individual and the needs of the role? What we find is when we do that and when we're clear, we start to equalize some of that bias, right? We start to kind of remove it from some places. And, it's this process of continually evolving to say, well, where is bias popping up now? Or how are we potentially disadvantaging one group versus another? And similarly with the pandemic, I've heard a number of folks say, well, everyone being virtual has helped to create a little bit more of a level playing field. And this idea, and I heard someone say before, we're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same ocean, but we are still in different boats, right? Some people live at home and have a quiet space where they can conduct a video interview. Other people are really struggling because they live at home with 2 or 3 generations and they've got a relatively small place. And so trying to find a place to host an interview or conduct an interview can be really challenging. And so the more that we can remove some of those things and recognize the biases that may be coming up and recognize the ways that we may not be creating the most diverse and most inclusive environment, the better we are at being able to mitigate those and be really deliberate about moving forward. And so again, part of what I would say, and I'll take a quick look at the chat because I know there have been a number of things coming through as I've been talking at you all. But this idea that if we're clear about the big chunks, right, the places where we're about to make strategic decisions, about to make significant hires, that can be some of the first work that you do, even if you're not doing some of the other pieces, but that ultimately tying this into the culture of your organization, the strategy of the business that you want to build, the way that you're going to go out and procure customers and procure, funding, to weave all of that together means that we're getting diversity and inclusion out of a silo, and we really are making it a part of our overarching strategy and a part of our business model as a whole. So I will stop sharing. Let's see if it'll let me stop sharing. And then I'm going to scroll back through some of these comments. Let's see. So Karen had a question. Is diversity more important now that we have proof it's good for ROI or that it's important to our humanity? I'm concerned that someone will come along with a research study that shows diversity doesn't work, isn't good ROI, and these initiatives will fall off trend. So ironically enough, and I know we've only got about a minute and a half, so you're welcome to hit me up afterwards as well. I describe it a lot of times as a buy one, get one free. And so for the people that already view it as a social good, more power to you. For the ones that have questions around ROI, I have almost never seen more compelling evidence that shows just having diversity alone doesn't benefit you because diversity without inclusion, I've called it for a long time, is a revolving door of talent. right? If you hire brilliant people and they don't feel like their voices are heard or that they're seen or that they're recognized, they're going to move on to someplace else. But overwhelmingly, whether it's McKinsey or Deloitte or Great Place to Work or the UN or any institution you can follow, find that diverse and inclusive teams are more effective. Again, back to this idea when it comes to non-linear, creative, non-routine tasks. So if you just need people to swing a hammer, get the best hammer swingers you can find. But if you want them to tell you, how can we make the process better? What should we be doing? What do we think the future is going to look like? I cannot fathom that there would ever be a world where that would not be the case and that somehow that data would reverse trend completely. Let's see, I've probably got time for maybe one more. Blind applications, example, acceptance rate of female founder, doubling the acceptance rate. It's very true, right? If you can remove some of those places that are triggers for people that say, well, these people don't traditionally fit in. If you can remove that, at least until you get later in the interview process, you absolutely increase the number of people that may not otherwise have gotten through the system or through the filter. So thank you everyone for the time. Hopefully this was helpful. I appreciate you spending some time with me and I have absolutely enjoyed it. And I will talk to you all very, very soon. Thanks all.